Josh, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and warm welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Perhaps you can start us off, Josh, with letting us know how you got into psychology and objectivism together, this unique combination. Well, not necessarily unique, but this combination where you're coming
Sure.
from.
It's a good question. So it came about really because I studied philosophy and psychology at university, and I'd read like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And I read The Fountainhead when I was a teenager, and I was interested in objectivism. And because the objectivist principles are true, they're going to be true in any field that I'm working in. So, I integrated them into my work. But I got really back into working in psychology about 8-9 years ago. First of all, starting off as an addictions counselor, and sort of expanding my repertoire from there. And I'm always using just I would say that the thing that's been most influential has been just everything to do with values and the importance of values and having a values hierarchy,
Yeah.
as well as the relationship between thoughts and emotions. Got a master's in EMDR, which is a type of trauma treatment, and so on.
So, what is
Yeah.
that for people that don't know? It's eye movement something or other.
Desensitization and reprocessing. It's one of the two most sort of validated, efficacious PTSD treatments, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay,
But
yeah.
it can be used for many ailments or issues, and it can also actually, which is great, be used for peak performance as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you don't have to be suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder
No,
to benefit.
not at all. You can actually just take what you're doing and try and to really improve and fine tune whatever it is you're doing.
I see. Also, you use cognitive behavioural therapy as well, don't you?
Yeah, I mean that's a big part of. I mean, EMDR itself is considered third wave CBT. Um, I mean, CBT is thank God it came back. It sort of really entered the psychological world in the 60s. But what's interesting in terms of objectivism is that was CBT. Basically, if we're going to be very basic here, says, sorry for saying basically basic, but what it says is that your emotions are driven by your thinking and are a response to your value judgments. Well, that's exactly what Ayn Rand was saying from the beginning. So it's great that psychology kind of finally caught up with that.
Is that quite a widely held conviction, or are you just representing a niche
In what means? Do you mean?
in recognition of the fact that one's thinking results in one's values and a value hierarchy, whether one's conscious or not, and then emotions swinging on that, as it were. Is that widely
Well, no,
recognised?
I think it's widely recognized amongst certain schools in psychology that one's emotions are a response to one's value judgments and
Mm,
your thinking. They might not necessarily use the term value judgment,
sure.
but that the way you think about something and what that means to you will result in certain emotional responses
Yeah.
compared to other people and what they value and think about something. So that they might not even use the word context, but there's a context of the thinking will result in different emotional responses. The most basic one is, I see a bear, I'm terrified and want to run. Little kid, baby might see a bear and have no experience of the danger of a bear, so judges it very differently and associates it with its teddy bear and thinks sweet or something like that.
So the emotional response depends on how the individual perceives, or no, the value they attach, or the implications of what they're seeing in relation to their values. And of course, if you value your life, seeing a bear is going to elicit fear, isn't it?
We always use the big examples to get the point
Yeah.
across. But for example, like I like what Dr. Binswanger says in his lectures on emotion is that the pleasure pain mechanism is based upon the input of the strength of, say, putting a pin into your skin. However, the harder you do it, the more pain you'll get, etc. And there's a similar mechanism going on with value judgments. That the more you value something, the greater the emotional response, or the more you disvalue something, but in the same context, that the greater the emotional strength.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
that makes perfectly good
yeah,
sense, isn't it? You've sort of overwritten and written again that message into your consciousness, haven't you? You know, not necessarily with any conscious conscious words, but you know, if you value your home particularly, you know,
yeah.
spending many years doing that is inevitably going to, you know, write it more uh, forcefully upon your consciousness, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, let's say that you had spent 15 years doing up a beautiful house and it burns down. It's going to be a very different emotional response to if you were renting a flat and you lost a few of your goods.
Yes,
You see, I mean,
absolutely.
like
Yeah.
one would be a lot, I would presume, unless that one would be a lot more extreme than the other, the sadness, etc., and anger.
Yeah. You see, I view what this back to front view of emotions as being primaries, which we see, of course, it's widespread out there in what I refer to as the matrix, our mainstream cultural download, if you will, sort of absorbed by most people in the absence of choosing their values and their convictions consciously.
Yeah.
It's very, very widespread, isn't it? And it sort of comes from
I,
Freud, I
I
believe.
Well, but I think actually what I mostly experience in the sort of general populace is when you explain or point out, one, a values hierarchy, and two, that that the way that emotions are tied to one's cognition, people never, very, very rarely refute it. They're just like, oh, I hadn't really thought about it. You know, it's that way around.
Bingo. Yeah.
So it's not. I don't think it's that they hold the other belief systems have been put there. I think it's just that they haven't really, for some people, it hasn't really crossed their mind. I think most people treat emotions as things that just kind of come and go. Sometimes you're going to be a bit happy, sometimes you're going to be a bit sad, and you ride it and everything. But even the whole mindfulness revolution that's been going on in the last, I mean, it's been around for a while, but say the last 5 years, where that's had a huge impact on the way people see the nature of their thinking and emotional responses and so on. So I think there have been, cultural shifts there,
Yeah.
and the impact of CBT is there too. But I don't deny what you're saying either. I think there are a lot of people out there who have been taught to emote above
Yeah.
thinking.
It does seem to be. It does. You know, our emotions are appealed to continuously, aren't they? With things like the climate issue, with things like religion. I mean, religion has been pulling at people's emotions, you know, ever since. Really, a lot
Yeah,
of it seems to be, dare I
but
say it, fear-based.
sure, but absolutely, but it's not. It's still looking at it in terms of the presumption with the environmental issue that's is put at you that you value this, and you should value this above everything else is the assumption, but it's still saying this is something you value and therefore that you should have a strong emotional response to that. Yeah, it's just that. And I think the general population, if you take the green movement is very nihilistic, wants to basically turn things back to the Stone Age, etc. When most people out there are like, yeah, I want to have clean rivers and and a nice air to breathe and eat good food, and that's where they're at, because those are all actually are good values, and most people are I speak to and say, think, oh, if we can get the technology right, then it's all cool.
Maybe you could just explain a little bit about mindfulness to, you know, if listeners aren't sure exactly what that is. I think we've all got a vague idea of what it is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So mindfulness is technically it just means in the moment non-judgmental focus or attention.
Okay.
So mindfulness is a, I think I look at it sometimes as like it's not particularly well defined, and this is the issue, but within kind of mainstream professional psychology, John Kabat-Zinn's definition that mindfulness means paying attention on purpose, non-judgmentally in the moment, is kind of seen as the most widely held definition. But basically I see it as mindfulness really is a genus. And underneath that you have introspection, interoception, and exteroception. And those are the sort of three sub-branches these days. So introspection is the ability to go inwards and look at one's own thoughts and feelings to a point that crosses over into interoception, which is the ability to notice what's going on inside one's body.
Yeah.
And then exteroception is what's going on outside of my body. But it's the training in a non-judgmental way that allows the mind to sometimes discover really what's going on, or to, if you take trauma treatment, interoception, the ability to see what's going on in your body, can help you bring you back into your body and learn that it's safe to be in your body, etc. Mm-hmm. Exteroception skills, they're all basically ways of training focus. Yeah. And so, the non-judgmental aspect is really important, because it allows you to sometimes see the full context without it can remove a layer of emotion that can sometimes stop you from actually noticing what's really going on with your thoughts, etc.
Right. Because making judgments is obviously a very important part of daily functionality, isn't it?
Essential.
We're making judgments all the time. Every time you meet a stranger, you have to make a snap judgment. Is this person going to mug me, or are they being friendly? And even the most basic judgments, we're making them all the time. But it's very fashionable also, again, to be non-judgmental. So how do you reconcile this need for judgment with a non-judgmental being present, if you like, of mindfulness?
Well, it's with mindfulness. It's within a very specific context. The non-judgment, it has a purpose. The purpose is to actually allow yourself to get the full picture, in a way.
Okay.
So in many ways, it's a bit like being a detective. Get all your facts first.
Right. So it's a question of sort of not rushing to make the judgment. Would you say?
So it's like, oh, I'm angry right now, and I'm feeling it in my heart, and what have I been thinking about, and so on. You'd really just notice what's going on, and that space of allowing yourself to notice allows you to get a much fuller picture. So it teaches like control, patience, etc. It also teaches you that you're not your thoughts totally, and it allows you to give you the possibility of seeing, maybe this is some of my errors in my thinking, and this is how I think, learn how you think, and then allow yourself to start challenging that in a more focused, non-mindful way. But in a way, it's like scanning something first before putting your judgments or prejudices on it first. So if you were like, I would scan your room first, like behind you right now, looking at everything. It's not like, because some people will just suddenly focus on the wood, and that's the only bit they can see, and they think that the only thing in your room is wood, and so on, so on, and so on. When people get trapped in obsessive thinking or depressive thinking, etc., mindfulness is particularly effective because it allows people to see the full picture.
Right. And do you think it's also a useful strategy for people out there that would consider themselves, mentally healthy?
Absolutely.
Is it a way of, can you become more conscious, if you like, through doing that?
You can become more conscious. It helps, increases your focusing skills. Also, the mistake people make about mindfulness is they think it's about chilling out. the chilling out it can be a consequence of looking at your thoughts, because sometimes you can, or what's going on inside you, and notice that actually it's not as bad as you thought.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the primary aim of it. Sometimes you can go in and you can come out of a very good mindfulness session much more anxious, because you're actually much more aware of the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
But in general, allowing yourself to find out often has a more calming influence than, it's like a lot of people report, hey, I wanted, when you're a teenager, I wanted to ask that girl out. You finally did, and she said no, but actually I feel better now because actually I went through with it and now I can move on.
Yes.
You can have something similar to that with your own thoughts, etc.
Yeah.
But the other thing is when you develop a mindfulness, it's so broad, but when you start to really focus on your breathing, etc., if you start doing what we call coherent breathing, which is also known as resonant breathing, so for example, breathing in for 5 seconds and out for 5 seconds, and maintain that for a long time, just focusing on the breath, focusing on that breathing cycle and nothing else, that can have a very profound impact, because when you're doing that, you can't think of anything else, so it can take you away from your anxieties for a while, etc. But what also that does is it regulates the autonomic nervous system. So your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system. So your parasympathetic, rest and digest, sympathetic, fight, flight, freeze, etc. When you have those in balance, certain things start happening to the brain. So, for example, when you are anxious or frightened, the limbic system takes over in the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, here, your most rational part, switches off. But if you start balancing the nervous system, the prefrontal cortex comes back online. When that comes back online, you can make much more rational decisions. So if you can exercise that muscle, it can increase your performance skills in terms of thinking.
Okay.
Yeah, you're going to be less stressed. There's going to be also, when you are in what we call a coherent state, your whole nervous system is balanced. You tend to release a hormone called DHEA, and that's like a building hormone, which makes you feel quite good and open. Think of it as the opposite of cortisol and stress. So all those factors can come together. So you may be a highly performing, very able person, but there's no harm. There's actually a tremendous amount of good that can come in and just exercising that muscle even more.
Yep.
Yeah. And giving yourself perspective and focus.
If we just zoom out and look at the context of today, there's an awful lot of anxiety and depression around, isn't there? There's an awful lot of depression and people not knowing how to solve their problems and so forth. Where do you pitch your the products you offer? You obviously do, we not obviously, but you do these surfing retreats.
Sure.
Resurfaceuk.com, I think, is the name of your website.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, resurface.com. So I'm working with people on an individual basis and very small group basis. So on Resurface, we offer two types of retreat: resilience and flow, which is all about peak performance and how to perform better. And we also offer trauma resolution retreats, which are about really helping people to start addressing their traumatic symptoms and how to come through that. And we use surfing as the sort of primary, what I call, flow tool on the retreats, because surfing provides an opportunity to set very clear goals, generate a new sense of mastery. It's really good fun. Being in the water is really great. Being in a group of people with a shared value system, even for that 1 week, is really enhancing and enlightening for people. It's also probably the best way of getting into what we call flow states, which are where you're performing at your best, feeling your best. It's also known as being in the zone, or if you play music, it can be known as being in the pocket, etc. But we put all those things together. So I'm working with people in small groups or individual basis and hoping to make an impact on that level.
So what's your secret, if I can call it that? What's your approach? Perhaps you can thrash out a little bit more of your technique in terms of getting people in the zone, in flow. For people that wanted to boost their performance, people wanted to maybe get to the next level in whatever they're doing.
So if you take something like the surfing, the reason we use surfing is surfing gives you immediate feedback. Either you're surfing or you're falling off. Yeah, you know if it's working or not. And that immediate feedback is essential for getting into flow states. But when you're in flow, your learning accelerates through the roof. I mean, McKinsey did a study that showed learning going, I think it was between 500% and 700% increase in learning. Wow. Same with creativity and so on. These, really, enhances the way you focus and the ability to learn and make new connections. So but to get into a flow state, you have to be primed. There has to be a sort of certain sense of anxiety or stress.
Okay.
And actually getting into flow is that balance between stress and relaxation. So I'll just give you a very basic example. If I was to play football with Christina, my partner's nephews, who are sort of 5 and 3, it would be relaxing, probably, and quite fun. If you put me on the football pitch at a Premiership game, I'd be so anxious I'd probably freeze or faint. Yeah. So for me to get into flow playing football, I need to be at that level where my skills meet the challenge.
Right.
Yeah. And actually, what the research is showing is actually to get into the highest flow state, the challenge needs to be about 4% above what I can currently do. And that push will push me to rise to the occasion.
Yeah.
When it goes past 4%, we become too anxious, too overwhelmed, and we often crash and fall. But that's what they've discovered from a lot of the training regimes put in, particularly. A lot of this came out from the extreme sports explosion in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Stephen Kotler's work in that area, it's very interesting to see. But we use flow states also as a way of driving the group practice work that we do afterwards, because what we find is that when you've been there's 4 stages to flow. There's what we call the stressor stage, then there's what we call the release, and then we have the section where you're in flow, and then we have the recovery stage. And when you're in the recovery stage, because you can only be in flow for about 90 to 120 minutes max, because you run out of energy. Basically, the body can't keep performing at that level. You burn out, and that's why most sports games, etc., are that length of time.
Yeah.
But when you come out of a flow state, which is fascinating, is you go into a different brainwave state. You right now we're in a beta brainwave state. You and I talking. When you first wake up in the morning and you're sort of kind of awake, kind of asleep, but functioning pretty well, that you're probably in alpha. When you're in flow, you're in theta and gamma, and they're much rarer.
Yeah.
And then when you come out of flow, you come into what we call delta brainwave state. And when you're in delta's that nice warm, gonna fall asleep sort of, I see you've got a wood burner in the back there, at the end of the day of a really satisfying day, and you're just feeling that kind of warmth and glow. You're most likely in delta. It's the same brainwave state that you get when you go into sort of guided relaxation meditations, etc. But when you're in delta, not only are you having lots of oxytocin and serotonin released in the system, so oxytocin being the bonding hormone and serotonin sort of happiness. It's a very vague way of saying it, but it feels great.
Yeah.
When you're in that delta brainwave state, you're making completely different kind of thinking goes on in the brain. Much more lateral connections are being made. So it allows for a different kind of creativity, but also it allows for people to go much deeper in the therapeutic work that we're doing compared to regular therapy.
Okay. Is it a kind of a sort of a joining of the dots behind the scenes in the brain? Is that what's going on?
Often.
Are things sort of knitting together and
often, those eureka moments that people report, they don't come out of nowhere. They come from many hours of thinking and deliberation and effort, and so, but they suddenly go ping.
Yeah.
And so many people have these sort of big moments that happen in those kind of states.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche said that all good ideas come after a long walk. And he's saying he's actually reflecting on the same thing, that people often get into flow when they're walking, when they're hiking, and at the end of the day, lots of good ideas become a lot clearer, and so on.
Indeed.
And so that's what we're using that very much as one of the techniques of facilitating fast change.
So, what sort of people are you aiming your retreats at? Obviously, we've mentioned that you do deal with post-traumatic stress disorder.
It's a good question. So the first retreats we did were trauma resolution, and trauma is an interesting one because it's an area, when people are very traumatized, it's an area where they don't have agency. Yet people beat themselves up so much for their lack of agency. So
what do you mean by agency?
So when, right now you and I can make decisions and think straight, and we're able to focus our minds, and I can choose whether I want to speak or not with you and which direction I take it in, etc. And you can do the same. Someone comes in with an axe, we get terrified, and some of the more automatic responses kick in. Now, when someone is traumatized, they get triggered. And when they get triggered, that event that from their past, etc., starts to replay because it's not being processed properly in the brain. So they'll go into a fight or flight response. Let's say there was a certain kind of smell. You get triggered by the smell, and suddenly you're taken back to some horrific event that happened, and you just freeze. There's a lack of agency there. You cannot help doing that. The agency is gone there.
Mm-hmm.
And after the event, this is one of the really sad things about people who are suffering from traumatic symptoms, is they give themselves such a hard time for their automatic responses,
right.
Non-volitional responses, basically there. So on the trauma resolution retreats, we're introducing people to resourcing and stabilization skills and certain ways of being able to recalibrate. If I was just to sum it up quickly.
Yeah.
And when I first set up Resurface, we were told that we were going to get mostly young men. And actually the age range has been 18 to 73.
Okay.
And we've had more women than men. Yeah. And after we did a few of those, we decided to try and incorporate a resilience and flow retreat, which is more about peak performance. And that's been really successful as well. So that in a way you could think of it that the trauma resolution is more for traumatized people, and peak performance is more for people maybe who are a little bit depressed or a bit stuck, or they know that they're doing good but they could be doing better and they're not quite sure what might be in the way of stopping them achieve that.
So go on. Sorry,
go on. Yeah,
I was going to say, how important do you think the ideas of Ayn Rand and her broadest principle of reason being our sort of most fundamental guiding principle, if you like. How important is that in the work that you do, and indeed across psychology?
Well, I think it's essential, but it's not always presented explicitly. Very rarely am I saying, here's a copy of the Fountainhead going. That's actually the one that I do the most. I will often sometimes say, if you really want to understand spirituality, read this book. If you want to understand it's her most psychological book by far. And
which one? Sorry, say it again.
The Fountainhead.
Fountainhead, yeah.
Yeah, but just the truth of the philosophy guides the work that I do. That the work that I do is evidence based.
Yeah.
It's based on observation, and the theory is taken from that. It's not me thrusting my abstract not related to reality ideas, my rationalistic ideas upon people.
I'd say that they are related to reality, but certainly I get what you're saying.
But my ones are.
Right.
My ones are, but what I'm saying is it's not just something that I know. Every intervention that we use on the retreat, we use because one, on a very on a very deep level, I've witnessed them working myself. I'm not taking it on faith.
No.
Yeah.
So when you say an intervention, just give us an example in case people are wondering, what does he mean by an intervention?
Yeah, intervention. That's a good question. So anything that intervenes in either your thinking or behavioral practice is an intervention. So a psychological intervention would be some way of challenging, or just basic exercise. Write out your 10 most positive memories is a form of intervention.
Okay.
But you can have a much more complicated form of intervention by, let's deconstruct your thinking around this issue and try and reconstruct it. Both of those would be known as an intervention.
Right.
It's anything that we use to intervene to facilitate a positive change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like what you say there about the fact that reason is sort of behind the scenes it's obviously foundational. We all function on reason every moment. From the moment you get up and you go to the bathroom and we cook ourselves breakfast and we drive to work, whatever it is we do, obviously all our actions are implicitly based on an objective reality, and etc. etc. And yet these things are always best slipped in sort of round the back door, as it were, rather than in your face. I like the way that you're saying there that it's all fairly discreet, isn't it? It's all part of the whole thing without being the bit that you focus on. Am I right?
Absolutely, because that people aren't coming on the retreats for a philosophy course. They're coming on the retreats to get well, or to not to get well, or to be better, or to have a very positive experience, or have some kind of reframing experience. But everything I do is based on a philosophy. I believe that these things work, and so on, and I believe they work for objective reasons, and so on. One of the lovely things about it all is actually I talk about Aristotle more actually in on the retreats, etc., because he's considered like the godfather of so many areas. But in psychology, he's made a real renaissance, and his concept of happiness is, well, the ancient Greeks didn't really have happiness. They had the concept flourishing, which is eudaimonia.
Yeah.
And so eudaimonia is often, in Aristotle, we use him a lot as an example of the good life, etc. And he's the sort of godfather of a lot of that work, and obviously the philosopher that Ayn Rand respected the most by far.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people will sometimes say that objectivism is Aristotelian Mark II or version 2, and I see a lot of why that's true.
Yeah.
So Aristotle comes up a lot.
Can you just elucidate a little bit on his view of happiness, just to crack that one open just a little bit more?
He distinguishes between hedonic pleasure. So one of the reasons that again, the Greeks didn't have happiness, but one of the reasons that we don't use the word happiness very much in psychology or in positive psychology is because it means too many different things to different people. Because some people, happiness is just purely hedonic, as in pleasure in this moment.
Yeah. Well, pleasure and happiness are completely mixed up, aren't they? I don't think many people would be able to distinguish, or be able to explain the distinguishing features of pleasure versus the distinguishing features of happiness. And they are two different concepts, aren't they?
Absolutely. And then, so that's why I very rarely use happiness, actually. I tend to just focus on flourishing more, or eudaimonia, which is, so eudonic happiness is long term. So hedonic is in this very moment I'm feeling good, or I'm feeling pleasure, etc. Eudonic happiness, if you want to call it that, or eudonic state, is long term. It's over. Aristotle said you could only tell if someone was happy when you analyze their whole life.
I think that's a key part of the definition of happiness. For me, happiness is long term, pleasure's short term.
Absolutely. So you could ask me, how are you? And I could say, actually, I feel really shit right now. I'm very anxious about a mistake with the tax man, and my friend is lost and can't find the house, and we're late, and I'm stressed out, but I'm happy.
Hedonism is also about just sort of following your feelings, isn't it? Tying back to what we were saying about emotions, it's more about do whatever makes you happy,
whatever feels.
Feel your way there. Which is
but it comes from the hedonic way of seeing things, that in the moment pleasure is what the goal is. There's a rehab in South Kent that I work at sometimes, but I work there much more and I used to run these workshops, and I used to put in a lot of quotations about happiness, for example, or flourishing, and I would always put So mine ran ones in there with Aristotle, and it was interesting the response from people, because some of the people who knew she would say, "Ugh, I hate her, but this is brilliant." I'd hear that all the time.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
that's my favorite quotation there.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't like her, but that's brilliant.
yeah.
Yeah, and I'm afraid that
I mean, it's so necessary to separate personality from ideas, isn't it? I mean, that almost speaks to a bit of a cult of personality going on there.
yeah, absolutely
Personally, I'm what I'm interested in is the ideas,
sure.
and she's left a fantastic legacy of ideas. I don't agree with all of them. I'd have to say up front,
Yeah,
but you know, if one looks at her writing as a treasure trove of ideas and just pick through and think them through and work out which ones you agree with and you don't. I think largely she was very spot on. But yeah, it's not about personality, is it? It's about
no,
the ideas themselves.
absolutely, absolutely. But that was just something I used to notice.
Yes, very
That,
interesting.
yeah, yeah.
So, may I ask you what your definition of flourishing is? Because this really is the big goal for us all, isn't it? I mean, people might say, well, happiness is, and obviously we'd have to get all our definitions on the same
Yeah.
page. But flourishing, what do you consider that to be?
I would say that the flourishing incorporates the emotional angle of, a lot of positive emotion in one's life, but flourishing also incorporates a lot of action and the pursuit and attainment of values. So I really like what Professor Martin Seligman, how he breaks down flourishing into what he calls his PERMA model. And he says you need all 5 of these things to really flourish. And that flourishing incorporates positive emotion, engagement, which is another name for flow, and eudaimonia, eudaimonia. Positive relationships, that's the R of PERMA, as in that, other people are of tremendous value to us.
Can be. That's conditional, though, isn't it?
It's conditional, but in general, when you get to the end of a lifetime, most people say that the highest values in their life were the people that they loved.
Surely, I just wanted to make the point, but it is conditional because a rapist or a mugger doesn't offer you any value whatsoever,
No,
do they?
but in general, people do,
Yeah,
and your friends do, and the reason that friendship is so important is because other people are of such high value to you. And actually, something very interesting that the psychologist Csikszentmihalyi says. He's a big pioneer of flow research, actually, but he also spoke about the importance of friendship and other people, even strangers, how important they are for the psyche. Is that going up to someone in the street and asking for directions requires a tremendous amount of cognitive skill. Yeah. And depressives isolate and then lose a lot of these skills. So other people help hone the mind and
right.
hone certain skill sets as well. And I always thought that was another interesting take on the value of other people. So the R is for relationships. And what's very interesting about relationships is people who are flourishing have all different types of relationships. So they have strong romantic relationships, hopefully. I mean, you find that people who are flourishing tend to be in a committed, they tend to be married or in a long-term relationship. They have good familial relationships. That doesn't mean you have to love everyone in your family, but that's a type of relationship. They have sort of good friends. They have friendly co-workers, etc. They have sort of relationships that are like one person may be more of a mentor and a mentee, and the other way around, etc. They're open to all types of relationship, and understand the value of the different ones, and are okay with the fact that different friendships have different natures, and because they have different natures, it's okay if you were friendly with someone but you drift apart because you've moved or gone to different countries or whatever it is, or jobs have changed, etc., and that's okay. So flourishing people have strong friendships, strong relationships, and they know where their esteem is high enough to know where they stand in their relationship. The M of the PERMA model stands for meaning and purpose. So people who are flourishing know why they're getting up in the morning.
Do you think that's all about having a central purpose to one's life, or can it be simply lots of little purposes?
Angela Duckworth has got some good work on purpose and goals. She talks about how we have to have, she doesn't call it the central purpose, but she calls it a primary purpose, or top level purpose. And she said we'll often have one or two. So the one or two in her context would be often one's career, and then maybe being a parent, something like that. They tend to be the two. And then she talks about having the mid-level. And the mid-level are the things that you're doing month by month to integrate into that central purpose, or top level. And then we have the third tier that she talks about of the kind of day-to-day things that you do, like you were just saying there, building a sandcastle or whatever it is. And that's the one that she says, if you want to, because the next, so meaning and purpose in the PERMA model, and then the A stands for accomplishment, which is highly associated with grit and goal setting and the achievement of goals.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, these things are all totally interrelated and interconnected, but we separate them out because some people, when you do that, go, oh, do you know what? I'm not doing so well because actually I understand my central meaning and purpose and I'm achieving a lot of goals, but actually I've kind of forgotten how valuable some of my friends are to me, and I need to spend some time with them because actually I get really good ideas from them, and they help pick up some of my flaws or whatever it is, you know.
Yeah.
And so on. So I would say someone who is flourishing has a strong sense of self-esteem. Self-esteem being the ability to know that you have the skills to live life and are worthy of happiness. That's how Ayn Rand defines it. And actually, so self-esteem asks two questions of you: am I able, and am I worthy?
Mm-hmm.
So in the work that I do, I will often look at some people, like, because I get a lot of people who come to see me and they're very able, but they don't believe they're worthy. And if you look at that, it's usually because they're living someone else's value system, not their own.
Right. Is that a common sort of hallmark, do you think, of depression,
Yes.
that people don't feel worthy in some shape?
I think what it is they're like, hey, look, I've got all this success, but I still feel shit. And the reason they still feel shit is because they haven't really put that focus necessary in what is their value system. You know, the classic example, which is in every other teen movie, is the kid wants to be a footballer and the dad wants them to be a dentist, and one of them chooses to become a dentist and is miserable even though they're very successful, etc. You know, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or whatever it is, usually in the film. Yeah. But flourishing people have a strong sense of self-esteem, and that needs to be worked on. They have an optimistic outlook, and they have a strong sense of resilience. So resilience is the ability to draw upon internal and external resources at a time that in a time of need.
Yeah.
So a resilient person is very happy asking for help, as well as they also have internal tools to manage as well.
Yeah.
So mindfulness would be a great resilience tool. Okay. The ability to refocus your mind, etc., in a time of immense pressure or stress.
Yeah.
And then calling up people of value who will value you and help you is another resilience tool. That's an external resource. So flourishing people have all of those things.
Do you think that this in the zone, this flow state, is that a component in flourishing in some sort of hidden way? Is it the flow of living?
It's kind of flow and purpose are the two most important factors when people report the sort of studies that say how happy are you, and when you reflect on your life, etc. You'll find that the people who always report that they're very happy in those sort of long big studies, they always report having a tremendous amount of flow in their life and having a real sense of meaning and purpose.
Wonderful.
And they feed into each other because flow states are incredibly pleasurable without being, I often say, like when I work in rehab, get into flow and you'll never need to take another drug again.
I've had fleeting moments of flow. I play the guitar, and
Yeah.
and you know, in various jam sessions with friends and things, you know, you know when you're in that sweet spot.
Totally.
All of a sudden, everything's magical, and you can't believe where's this coming from. You know, your fingers are all
Call it,
working.
you call
Everyone's
it effortless effort.
yeah.
Yeah.
It is really quite
And
magical, and you can. I found just in the guitar playing example,
yeah.
I can be in the zone for 3 seconds and then out for the next 2 minutes,
Yeah.
and then in for 10 seconds. You know,
Yeah.
it can be quite transitory.
Yeah.
In that
It is.
example,
It can be, but the more you practice, the more deliberate practice you do, the easier it is to flow.
Mm-hmm.
So all that hard work that you put in, the grit side of it, the long-term grit is defined as like perseverance for long-term goals. But all that practice that you do, those scales and things that you do, when it comes to those moments, flow becomes a lot easier because something takes over. And you know, when you're in flow, everything just makes total sense and is easy to do. And group flow is actually the flow that seems to be the most rewarding.
Group flow.
Group flow, it seems to release more chemicals, more satisfaction.
I mean,
any other type.
The music example is an obvious one for there, but how would that work? You know, in more general ways in people's lives.
So team sport versus individual sport.
Okay. Yeah.
For example, it just seems that's what the research seems to show, and it's not for altruistic reasons or anything like that. It's just for the fact that you're even more stimulated. You are not only you focusing on what you're doing, but you're focusing on what other people are doing. So there's that even more heightened sense of action going on there, and also that tremendous amount of rewards that, you know, we pay as human beings who are not professional athletes, etc., professional musicians. We pay huge amounts of money to watch people in flow. So we enjoy it.
Yeah.
Just in an observational
it's a win-win-win, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So when you're engaged in group flow, not only are you flowing, but you're getting the pleasure of watching other people flow, because you're watching expertise. That's you know, and it's tremendously satisfying.
You can actually help people find this flow state.
Absolutely.
Through the techniques you offer. Well, that's really encouraging.
Yeah, and there are certain flow triggers, and Seligman has an interesting study that you can look at online, a questionnaire called the VIA. Some people call it the VIA, but it's the VIA character strengths test. And his thinking is that you identify your top. So let's say you're someone who's quite lost. You kind of know that your life isn't really working and this isn't what you want it to be, but you're not quite sure who you are and where you want to go, or you might be getting to a different age in your life where you just can't do the things you did before, etc. His argument, and it's good, it's a very useful tool, is to identify your top character strengths, and he's got a questionnaire that does that, and base your activities around those top character strengths. Because when you're doing activities using your top character strengths, you tend to rise to the occasion. When you are using your lowest character strengths, when you finish something, you tend to just be terribly relieved and never want to do it again.
That makes perfect sense, doesn't
it? So design and do activities that reflect your top strengths.
Play to your strengths,
And that totally ties into what's called the challenge. It's the skills challenge ratio.
Okay.
So the challenge of something and your skill level to meet it.
Yeah.
That totally ties into, of course, one's character strengths would come into play there.
Yeah. Details below to how to find your website for anybody who's interested in boosting their flow.
But also, I'd put that on there as well. The VIA character strengths test is at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
You can just pop it in.
Yeah.
And then I would. There's a fantastic TED talk on flow by. It's very hard to pronounce. He's called Csikszentmihalyi, and his name is about 20 letters long. He's Hungarian, but he's the sort of leading expert on flow in the world, the sort of first guy to really break it through. But if you put in into TED Talks, Flow.
Yeah.
You'll get his talk on flow, which is great. It's a really great starting point.
Excellent. Maybe I can just change tack
Yeah, yeah.
slightly here.
Let's do.
In terms of psychology in general,
Yeah,
um, do you there it has been said that psychology sort of has it's sort of labeled lots of behaviors as dis-ease and psychological
yeah.
illness. There are those that sort of say that whole approach is not true. It's more about I'm not sure what the counter argument is. Dysfunctionality. It's not really disease. Do you have any thoughts on that you'd be
I think
prepared to share?
I think that there are certain people who definitely have diseases. You know, mental disease. You know, we're happy to call it mental illness. So it is a form of illness in a lot of people, and that's often rooted in thinking issues.
Yeah. Is it not? You know, if you get into bad thinking or bad sort of habits of the way
Yeah,
you use your consciousness, shall we say, can you not sort of disappear down a sort of a negative spiral?
totally.
Is that what people call disease, illness? It's not something you catch, is it? It's not
No,
sort
it's
of viral or
no,
bacterial.
no, it's not. But it's not, and this is why often I get quite annoyed when people just say to me, "Oh, I just got depression."
Yeah, so they've caught
Yeah,
it. Yeah, like
yeah,
a
or
cold.
it's just or they can't see that there's a causal connection of that. However,
That's where I suppose I'm going. The causal connection thing.
as much as there is that a lot of mental illness is down to serious cognitive issues. However, there is a much smaller percentage than is made out of people who suffer from something like OCD. OCD is a real issue, and it's a problem with one part of the brain. People who have
Obsessive compulsive
compulsive,
disorders. So that's
yeah.
somebody having to sort of have everything just so, isn't it?
Well, that's what's the tragedy. That's what's used in the movies because you can film that. But most OCD is actually inside the brain, internal. So in one's thinking, etc. So people with OCD are often trying to create order so they'll count how many edges there are in the room or what's the middle letter in a word and things like that. Because what's really sad about someone with those OCD, and it's on a spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
but someone with OCD is unable to scrub a thought.
Okay, well,
So,
just
for
literally
example,
move on from it. You mean, yeah?
yeah, every so often we have thoughts that pop in, and you sort of go, "Oh, that's a bit weird. Glad no one's in my head reading my thoughts right now." You know,
Press
and
eject.
yeah, you can often scrub it, or you'll drive. One of the classic OCD reactions is someone drives down the street and they hear a bang or a clump under the car, and they think, "Oh, have I just run someone over?" And you look in your mirror and you realize there was no scream and blah, 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 blah. Then you clearly haven't run someone over. But someone with OCD is unable to scrub that away.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So sometimes they require the best interventions for OCD currently are a mixture of medication and cognitive therapy. That
Okay.
there are those issues there.
Yeah. So there are
Also,
real
yeah,
mental
totally. Yeah, absolutely.
illnesses.
And then there's things like if you take certain types of trauma, PTSD, etc., that is not down to someone's poor thinking. That's because
Sure.
the brain has been fundamentally altered by a traumatic incident and they're having reactions that they can't control. So when I was saying there's no agency, you take something like bipolar. When you meet someone with bipolar, it used to be called manic depression. When they're on extreme high or something, you'll often experience them sometimes as like they're almost possessed or something. And that is a serious, chemical issue going on in the brain. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't. I have to be very careful about saying exactly what's going on, etc. And I never
Sure.
discuss medication because I'm not licensed or anything in that area to even begin to go there or train. But there are clearly biological markers and effects that go on that are not to do with one's sort of software. It's the hardware can be broken, but most of the time it's software issues. if
Okay.
that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it does. I quite
But it
like
does,
quite
yeah,
like the computer analogy for a lot of thinking and sort of mental ideas, to use this analogy of computer and software, hardware, and all that sort of thing. But I was quite surprised to learn recently that in something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental
yeah, DSM
Disorders,
five,
the
yeah,
DSM that you're probably very familiar with. Um, I heard that there are actually, for diagnosed conditions, there are actually exemptions for religious beliefs, which struck me as being quite crazy. Is the psychology profession sort of effectively kowtowing to
yeah.
to the religious fraternity,
Well,
essentially?
it's just to the Equalities Act and things like that. People.
I remember hearing a lecture where Nathaniel Brandon was comparing a mystic to a schizophrenic, saying that both of them deny the law of identity and causality. Both of them sort of hold their own delusions
Yeah,
as real, and the facts of reality as expendable. And it's quite alarming, really, when where you. I mean, I suppose I'm also getting extremely controversial, but when you bring those two things together and think, my goodness.
it's very, very difficult to. So if we take the DSM-5, the DSM is all the diagnoses in there are voted upon by a group of psychiatrists. So they apparently they decide whether this is the thing or not, and they vote
Okay.
on it. A lot of people are starting to use the ICD more than the DSM. They're often used for insurance. So if it's in the DSM, you can get the insurance to pay for it, and if it's not in there, and so on. So
Right.
there's all sorts of issues in there, etc.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who want to reject the DSM and look and use. When you're working one on one with someone, very rarely you sitting there thinking, you have a mixture of this, and this. You're working with the person,
Yeah.
but it can be a very useful to as a sort of shorthand notes thing to say someone, they've got borderline traits, or
Yeah.
they're depressive, or and so on.
Uh,
But a lot of them are derivatives of just other forms of thinking or issues.
yeah.
Yeah,
I find it fascinating, the sort of overlap where philosophy, even sort of lurking unseen to most people, sort of has an effect in all these areas, and indeed in psychology, because things like the idea of that we have free will, which
yeah,
which of course you will subscribe to, and so do I, um, and probably a lot of listeners do, because it seems fairly self-evident that we have free will. You can decide when you go to the bathroom or
yeah.
not.
I think actually most people believe in free will,
Yeah, and
but
yet,
they
and yet,
struggle with some of the deterministic arguments that are
yeah,
thrown at them, because I've struggled with this sometimes. Like, I've realized that my thinking, I fall into very materialistic traps. So I would think, well, if everything is, we live in this causal world of, and I'm that mistake that I made, that everything is billiard balls banging into each other, then therefore how do we get something that goes against that? But actually I've made a massive error, that causation isn't about billiard balls banging into each other. Causation is to do with the nature of something. And also, just because I can't come up with a, a reason of why this works right now doesn't mean it's not true.
indeed,
We it's a funny one in the world of free will. We reject all the I'm not you and I, but in general, people, when they really go into it, reject all the evidence for it because they can't have a causal explanation for it yet.
mm. And
So then,
some people use this idea, this billiard ball theory of the universe, where everything knocks into each other, as a they almost implicitly expect something to sort of push them into thinking or into action or into doing
yeah,
something, which
yeah,
is an unfortunate, implicit demonstration of determinism. And a lot of people are fatalists. They might say, they might not use the word determinism. They might say, oh well, it's meant to be. I hear so many people saying it's meant to be, And I always want to interject and
Yeah.
say,
But
"Are you sure?"
again, when they say it's meant to be, I think they're actually a lot of the time coming from the right place. They're using bad language, bad terms.
Absolutely.
But what they're
Yeah.
saying is, if you do X, Y, and Z, then these results are going to happen.
Sure. Yeah.
So you say it was meant to be because you worked really hard. It was
Hmm.
meant to be. I think there's an element of
There
that
is an
going.
element. Yeah.
Yeah,
But there are
but
still some people who
yeah,
believe
totally.
that things are fated.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we just go back to almost the beginning of our conversation, when we talk about mindfulness, Rand's definition and her real breakthrough on free will, and I use this all the time with clients, is when I get the odd client who comes in and says, I've been listening to Sam Harris or something like that, and I'm like, do I have any choice in anything I do and everything like that? I say, well, you know, free will is often nowadays often seen by the most progressive people, I'd say, as a way of focusing one's mind.
Hmm.
That's what Ayn Rand is saying, is that one is able to focus one's mind, and that's the truth. That's where volition lies. That's where choice lies.
We're able to
And
choose the primary goal, aren't we, on which we focus? You can go
yeah,
make a cup of
well,
tea. You can go into
you can choose to focus or not, and you can actually have influence over the level of focus that you have as well. So mindfulness is a very good tool for being able to increase that capacity to focus your mind. So in a way, it's helping, it's boosting your free will capabilities. Yeah,
Excellent. That sounds
yeah.
good.
So, I don't know how we focus. I don't know how that initial switch happens biologically yet, but it's still a fact that I can do these things.
Yeah.
Introspectively, I know that I make choices and I act on those choices.
Yeah.
And most people, I think, believe that. It's like, I like what they say about skeptic philosophers. I think Joran Brook said this once, and it made me laugh. He said, they go and teach their class at university that you can't rely on your senses and you know nothing. And then they leave, and they certainly are relying on their senses to cross the road, and and so on. And they believe in their senses all day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. And
Except
it's
for the purposes of some minute philosophical, you know,
just a
disagreement.
philosophy class. Yeah,
Yeah, it's just
yeah,
crazy,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah,
That sort of thing. I think it's very destructive when it seeps through into people's consciousness as, how can I know the truth? Those people don't know, nobody knows. How can we know anything?
yeah,
And that's I think a result of these philosophical ideas sort of permeating through, and it's just not true, really.
mm,
It's just not true. I think certainty is achievable, but that's another
yeah.
conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah,
It's
but
interesting. I'm sorry. Go on.
yeah, I'd say it all comes down to perceptual data in the end. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I've just been reading more of OPAR, which is Leonard Peikoff's book on objectivism, and that we have to be able to derive everything. Proof has to always come back down to perceptual data.
Yeah.
Ultimately, that's the
Yeah. The
and
self-evident, right at
yeah,
the
exactly.
bottom of the base of everything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think Nathaniel Brandon said he was a psychologist, I think, wasn't
Yeah,
he? Um, and
wrote this. He was the father of the self-esteem movement.
right, indeed,
Yeah,
and he once said that determinism claims that we don't have any free will, and yet he claimed it's one of the defining characteristics of psychosis, is to lose volitional control over your
yeah,
rational judgment, which amounts
absolutely.
to the same thing. So
Yeah,
again, you sort of got psychology and overlapping with these other philosophical ideas which are demonstrably not true.
yeah. Yeah,
Very.
when people hold um, false philosophical premises, they often go a bit mad.
Yeah.
Yeah, inevitably.
It's acting on untruth, isn't it? Really,
Yeah,
it's in the most fundamental way, which is never going to work. Well, Josh, thank you so much for your time
my pleasure.
tonight. Really appreciate a wonderful chat. I hope listeners have got some benefit about flow and mindfulness, and indeed there'll be details below as to how to
Yeah.
reach your website.
And if anyone has any questions or anything, just feel free to email me. I'm very happy to respond. I actually really enjoy it, so it's not a burden on me.
Great. I do urge you to visit the website lawfulrebel.com as well. There's loads more there as usual to help you take control of your life and thrive. And thank you so much for listening, and do join us again.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.